I made a full Cambridge style guest paper for PO3 for the October-November 2024 series, and it also comes with a Cambridge style marking scheme. On top of that, I also have a few predictions of the questions that could come up in this series, so let's get into it. If you haven't watched my prediction videos for Pure 1 and Stats 1, make sure to check those out. But anyways, looking at PO3, let's start with the first topic, Algebra. I've split algebra into 4 questions: the modulus, factor and remainder theorem / polynomial division, partial fractions, and binomial expansion. This topic is the most valuable topic in PO3, so because of this, it typically comes with a lot of marks. Every time this topic explodes, you have a partial fractions question, which has appeared in all but 2 of the last 11 papers, and there's usually a helping hand from one of modulus, factor and remainder theorem, or binomial expansion. So in case it wasn't clear, given the consistency of partial fractions, I am almost certain that it shows up in the November series with its standard 5 marks. As for the helping hand, it's anyone's guess really. In the guest paper, which you can find on my website, link is in the description, you'll find that I've gone for the partial fractions to binomial expansion combination, but to be completely honest with you, I'm not too sure about the binomial expansion part. The second topic, logarithmic and exponential functions, is a lot more straightforward. It splits into 2, your logarithms and exponential equation, that's the question where you're solving for x, or your linear log question, that's the one where you have to reduce a logarithmic equation to a linear form. If we're going solely off appearances, it's a no-brainer as to which of the 2 questions come. But the May June series kind of makes things a little bit tricky. You see, the linear log question is one of those questions that appears once in a blue moon. I could probably count on one hand the number of times this question has appeared in the past 2 years. In fact, one finger, because it's only appeared once in the past 2 years before the June series this year. In this June series, we got a clean sweep of linear log questions. Every June paper had a linear log question, but going off of history, this is still a pretty rare question that Cambridge throws into the mix every once in a while. And so I'm going to ignore the June hype, and I predict that this question does not show up in October, but instead we get the textbook solve for X question. Trigonometry was almost completely absent in the May June series, recording 0 marks in the variant 1 paper and a measly 3 marks in each of variant 2 and 3. Yes, this is not a very explosive topic, but this is quite underwhelming for a topic that typically averages around 6 to 7 marks per paper. Obviously, I was curious as to why it did so terribly, and it began to make sense when I looked at the integration in the June series, which we'll get to in a bit. But for the November series, I assume we'll be back to normal service. Of the 2 questions in trig, I expect a double angle / compound angle question to come up, but there's not too much between the 2 questions. We could just as well get a harmonic identity, which is that R sin R cos question. Differentiation is one of the more dominant topics in Pure 3, and it has 4 types of questions, but in reality it's pretty much just 3. Implicit functions, parametric equations, and the stationary point question. When an implicit function comes, parametric equations tend not to come, albeit the implicit function comes more often than not. In the guest paper, however, I've actually gone against the implicit function question. The last time we saw a parametric equations question was last year in October. It feels like this question is long overdue, and like I said, it last appeared in October last year. So one could make the argument that this is an October question, and so we could see it again in this year's October series. But take this with a grain of salt because the numbers suggest that an implicit function is more likely to come. Now these 2 questions are typically accompanied by the stationary point question. This question has appeared in 8 of the last 11 papers, which makes it surprisingly more common than both the implicit function and parametric equations questions. And so it probably does appear in this October series as well. Integration is arguably the most dominant topic in Pure 3. It's surprisingly quite random. Of its 4 questions, you should probably watch out for the integration by parts question and the substitution question, which are my 2 picks for the October series. Now for integration by decomposition, this is the question where part A is decomposed into partial fractions, and then part B is integrate this and show that this reduces into some expression of ln x. So it's either we get the combination of partial fractions to binomial expansion, like I mentioned earlier, or partial fractions to integration by decomposition. And ultimately I chose binomial expansion solely because it comes up slightly more frequently, but it could be either or. As for the integration of trig functions, which I hinted to earlier when we were talking about trig, this is a pretty rare question. I don't know if you've noticed, but it seems that each series sort of has like a theme to it. For example, in the June series for Pure 1, you could tell that the discriminant questions were coming with a bit of psychogeometry to them, and there was an interest in the increasing and decreasing functions, which is pretty rare. For Pure 3, the theme seems to be that Cambridge wanted you to integrate trig functions, and so as a result, this means that the trigonometry topic itself carried few marks because most of them were embedded in the integration question. I feel like this integration of trig functions is just a theme of the May June series, and I don't think it carries over into the November series. So my picks for integration are integration by parts and integration by substitution. Numerical solutions is one of those one-trick pony type topics. Apart from the question where you have to sketch two graphs, it's almost always the same question. It's a three-part question in which part A is show that A is equal to blah blah blah, part B is verify that a root lies between these two numbers, and part C is the iterative formula question. And this is the exact question that I expect to come up in October, but obviously Cambridge will try to masquerade the question so that it's not as straightforward, but there's nothing really to it. Now, there's something quite interesting about this topic that shocked me. There's 9 topics in P3, and the average paper has 11 questions. So it makes sense for Cambridge to fit in all 9 topics into every single paper, except occasionally Cambridge seems to just flat out omit the numerical solutions questions in some of the papers, and this seems to happen mostly with variant 3 papers. In fact, it happened this May June series. I just found this interesting, but don't read too much into it because it's a pretty rare occurrence. Vectors is a pretty painful one to split because it just has so much going on. So I ended up splitting it into the scalar product applications, which are mainly the foot of the perpendicular and the angle between two lines questions. It has the parallel, intersect, and skew lines question, and it also has the find the vector equation of a line. And then the fourth type of question is pretty much everything else that I couldn't fit into the first 3 questions. But at the end of the day, the most frequent questions are your scalar product applications and your lines questions. So just make sure to practice those and you should be fine. Differential equations, apart from separating the variables, is pretty much just integration. This is why integration is arguably the most dominant topic in P3. 2 of the 9 topics are dedicated to integration. And so differential equations is just a question of how good is your integration. If your integration skills are good, this topic will be straightforward for you. If they're questionable, this topic is going to be a long day for you. It splits into 2 questions. The standard solve the differential equation obtaining an expression for y in terms of x, or some variation of that. Then it also has the rate of change as a DE question. This is where you're given a scenario involving rates of change, and using that information, you're supposed to formulate a statement that leads to you creating a differential equation. Sounds terrifying, right? Yeah, it is. But don't worry, it's a pretty rare question. It will only show up in the October series if you guys are unlucky. But expect the textbook differential equation. Finally, complex numbers. This is probably the one topic that Cambridge has a lot of room to experiment with and bring in some completely novel questions. But in the past couple of years, it seems like Cambridge hasn't done anything too crazy with it. It has ridiculous depth. It splits into about 6 topics. To be fair, it's probably even more than that. You've got your complex polynomial equations, Euler or polar form, your 2 square roots, division of complex numbers, your modulus and arguments, and of course your argand diagrams. The 2 square roots question is probably the rarest question in Pure 3. You could probably go throughout A levels without learning about it and still be fine. In the past 4 years, I've only seen 2 of these questions before this May June series. So we're probably expecting to see it again in maybe say 2026. Polar form is also quite rare. That being said, it seems like for May June the theme was obscure questions, because with the integration of trig functions, now we've got the 2 square roots and we also have the polar form. Division of complex numbers and modulus and arguments rarely come in isolation. There are more features or techniques that you have to apply to the larger concepts in complex polynomial equations and argand diagrams. And these are the 2 questions that I expect to show up in October. The argand diagram is the most common question in all of Pure 3, so you can be sure it's coming. Just to summarize everything, I'm going to list all the topics that I think you should give more attention to because they have a high likelihood of coming. So the list is as follows. Partial fractions, logs, and exponential equations. That's the solve for x question. Double angle/compound angle, implicit functions, parametric equations, stationary point question, integration by parts, integration by substitution, textbook numerical solutions, scalar product applications, parallel, intersect, and skew lines, textbook differential equation, complex polynomial equations, Argand diagrams. That's a lot. So using all of these predictions, I created a full Cambridge-style guest paper and is available on my website, and it comes with a full Cambridge-style marking scheme. It's literally the exam before the exam. So if you want an unfair advantage going into the October series, make sure to get yourself a guest paper. For schools who are interested in using our guest papers or would like us to create their mock papers, feel free to fill in the form on our website and we will assist you. And to those who made it to the end of the video, you can use the discount code SMYLStudentGuestPaper to get 50% off on all your guest papers. I wish you all the best in your exams. Bye bye.